Good evening, everyone. Kaya Waju. Hello and welcome to this University of Western Australia Public Policy Institute webinar that will be focusing on food security and a changing climate. My name is Shamit Sagar. I'm the director of the Public Policy Institute I mentioned a moment ago, and I'm delighted to welcome you from wherever you may be sitting. It is early evening here in Perth in late spring. We're joining you from adjacent to the University of Western Australia campus, which is the traditional land of the Whadjuk Noongar people. And in pre-European colonial and settlement times, this was a land of traditional learning. And it's a source of great pride to me that it continues to be so as part of the University of Western Australia. The Public Policy Institute. We were established a couple of years ago by the university as part of a drive that is in fact common internationally. Many of you will have observed leading research-intensive universities committing themselves to ensuring that the fruits of important cutting-edge research are translated and swiftly placed in the hands of decision makers, not least of all in government. And we're very much part and parcel of that movement and that pivot. We do many things, which you can, of course, look at in your own time on our website. But above all else, we try to make sure that we're at the center of important emerging public policy challenges and issues here in WA. We spend a lot of time on convening, as it were, issues of the day, and they may be to do with food security, may be very unrelated. We spend a lot of time also on capacity building, training and encouraging and supporting our academics to work more closely with the decision makers. And we also in the business of creating formal networks that knit together the research and public policy community. The internship program was established last year, and we're very proud to have a number of interns that have joined us, committed to carrying out very important work. And this year we've brought in 4 interns, and in particular, the 2 who will be co-moderating this evening's session, Jemah Harrison and Crellin. I thank them very much for their time and commitment and also selecting and curating this topic, and of course in a moment for running the event itself. I'm going to hand over to them in a moment. You really didn't tune in to speak to me or hear from me at great length, but it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event, to thank in advance our distinguished group of experts and indeed the audience to participate when it comes to a moment for question and answer. Jemah and Chris, we're entirely in your hands. Let me hand over to you.
Thanks for that, Shamit, for the introduction. So tonight we're exploring the topics of food security and climate change, where we'll be specifically focusing on food production and wastage as subsections of the food system. Food security relates to a region's capacity to produce and have access to sufficient nutritious produce to feed its population. The reason why we are wanting to highlight these topics stems from the growing effects of climate change on food production and wastage and vice versa in Australia. So Australia is highly susceptible to the impacts of climate change. As you've seen, we've experienced droughts, floods and ravaging bushfires, which results in the perpetuation of food insecurity in the form of unequal access to healthy, affordable, convenient and appropriate meals. Simultaneously, the food system contributes to 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions, further adding to the issue of climate change. So in promoting a green and just transition to net zero emissions, the food system must be considered and integrated into Australia's climate change response across all levels of governance.
So to help us shed some light on these topics, we're joined by a distinguished panel of guests tonight. Introducing firstly, Ronni Kahn AO. Ronni is the founder and CEO of OzHarvest and a renowned activist for disrupting the food waste landscape in Australia. Ronni also advises government and plays an instrumental leading role in changing federal laws to improve social justice and environmental policies. For her work, Ronni has been awarded an Order of Australia and was named Australian Local Hero of the Year. Thank you for joining us from Brisbane, Ronni.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.
We're also joined by Dr. Ben Cole tonight. Ben is the Managing Director and co-founder of Wide Open Agriculture. He has a PhD in environmental engineering and is a social enterprise expert with a passion for startup and growth companies. Ben has spent 10 years working overseas in developing economies as a grant manager of water supply and sanitation projects in Malawi. Thank you for joining us, Ben.
Thanks, Jemah. Thanks, Chris.
Next up on our panel is Dr. Caitlin Moore. Dr. Caitlin Moore is a research fellow at the UWA School of Agriculture and Environment. Her main research focuses are on native and managed ecosystems, bioenergy sustainability, food security in tropical savannas. Caitlin has collaborated on projects aimed at improving food security in the coming century, such as the Realising Increased Photosynthetic Efficiency project. Thank you for joining us, Caitlin.
Thanks for having me.
Finally, we're also joined by I-Lyn. I-Lyn is the Director of Regional Development at the Wheatbelt Development Commission and is also a Churchill Fellow investigating consumer drivers and incentives for regenerative agriculture. I-Lyn has almost 15 years of experience in various aspects of policy development, implementation and evaluation through a variety of roles within the West Australian Government. Thank you so much for joining us, I-Lyn.
Thank you, Jemah. Thank you, Chris.
So just for running down the format of the event tonight, for the next 40 minutes or so, Jemah and myself will be moderating a discussion with our panelists. This will then be followed by a Q&A session for about 30 minutes. With regards to the Q&A session, can you please use the Q&A function and not the chat function in Zoom? And we'll try to address as many questions as possible in the time. So to kick off, and this question is for all panelists, food security relates to a region's capacity to produce and have access to sufficient nutritious produce to feed its population. So what do you see as the main challenges that climate change presents to the Australian and global food systems? May I ask Ronni to start us off, especially with your experience in the food waste landscape?
Absolutely, and thank you so much. It's a great question. From the floods in Australia and the war in Ukraine, the supply chain has been impacted by major loss of crops and other factors like fuel and, of course, fertilizer costs that are driving up prices. In the last 2 months, the cost of veggies has gone up by 7%, and we keep hearing about a head of lettuce that is now $12 or capsicum that's $14 a kilo. So this obviously has a direct effect on everyone, but for those who are already struggling, putting food on the table is harder than ever. So food insecurity is a huge problem. 1 in 6 Australians don't have enough food. And what we are seeing now is a new cohort of people who are turning charities to charities for the very first time in their lives. 64% of people seeking food relief actually have a job. And at the same time, 7.3 million tons of food is wasted every year, and it's costing the economy $36.6 billion. So addressing food waste and food security together has got to be a national priority.
Great, thanks for that. Ben, can I just get you to jump in on this one, especially around your background in regenerative farming?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Ronnie's position on food waste being such a key component of the sort of weaponry against fighting climate change through a new food and farming system. When you look, we've been really informed by the Drawdown project, which is a great database that sort of looks at all of the different mechanisms for fighting accelerating climate change across a range of sectors. And in food and agriculture, yeah, it is food waste. Ronnie's spot on. And then it's a real shift towards plant-based diets. It's sort of basic sort of physics that it doesn't go through a mechanical process or a sort of a transformed process of animal protein, you do get better sort of benefits from it from an energy perspective, which is related to the use of the sunshine in the soil. And then the third is really regenerative farming practices that draw down carbon into rich soil, that reduce the needs and reliance on chemical fertilizers and pesticides and herbicides, which all come from fossil fuel based systems. So yeah, we see regenerative agriculture as being one of the many planks in reinventing the food and farming system. So it's doing positive things for climate and biodiversity rather than negative.
Great, thanks. And I-Lyn, do you have anything to add to that?
Thank you. I want to address that whole regenerative agriculture and climate change. I think one of the challenges that climate change presents actually is a tunnel vision towards just reducing carbon emissions. And actually, I think regenerative agriculture presents that holistic view that we actually need for our food systems, incorporating like soil health and biodiversity and, probably even food waste and sustainability of our farming enterprises. But going back to the actual questions, I think there are actually three things here I'm going to talk about the production aspects. One is, obviously, we all know that climate change has productivity challenges for our farmers. The changing climate impacts on, the types of food we grow and the rate at which they grow. But interestingly, with the opportunities that come from climate change and all the carbon credits, a lot of people are seeing our productive agricultural land as a potential carbon sink for non-agriculture sectors. So if we think about it that way, it's I guess, a double-edged sword for our farming sectors. And then, of course, the other challenge is our farmers meeting the required, I guess, standards that would be placed upon them by consumers, by customers, in terms of their food production and a carbon footprint.
Great, thanks. I'll just get Caitlin, if you've got anything to add to that, especially, I guess, with that whole carbon sink idea and the carbon sequestration sort of processes that occur at a more finer level.
Yeah, certainly. And I couldn't agree more with a lot of the comments that have already been made. And I think the one thing that really sticks with me in all of this is that climate change is really exacerbating the challenge of our great challenge of providing enough calories to feed the world's growing population, because that's what it really fundamentally comes down to. Can we provide enough food for the world to eat? We're fortunate here in Australia that we produce more food than we consume. We're net exporters of food to the world, but we're not really immune to the impacts of climate change. And, Ronni spoke about some of those earlier with the floods in Eastern Australia and the price of food going up. And we're also in the past with droughts as well and heat wave events. And so I think overall the rising global temperature is really putting increased pressure on our food production systems through its effect on our water resources, so for both cropping and for livestock, but also it puts pressure on the efficiency of crops to actually photosynthesize and convert light and carbon dioxide into the food and energy that we consume. And so ensuring that crop productivity can not only be maintained but increased under a more variable climate as we progress in this century is, I think, the key challenge that we really face in order to continue to produce enough calories for people to consume.
Cool. Thanks for all those insights and just a general introduction into the challenges that we're going to be facing now, but also in the future. So building on these challenges, and Caitlin, with your research on how ecosystems respond to climate variability and stresses, could you explain a little what Australian ecosystems and maybe touch on agricultural ecosystems more specifically, but which are the most responsive to the threats of climate change?
I was thinking about this question earlier, and it's a challenge because there's no one size fits all answer for this question. And I'm sure if there are food producers that are tuning in now, a lot of the resilience in our agricultural systems really comes down to the timing of these severe weather events that affect our agricultural systems, how quickly we can actually respond to mitigate those effects, and whether the system can really recover from its effects afterwards. And so, for example, if there's a severe storm that's forecast for a given region, or say if a producer has a sort of smaller scale, high value horticultural cropping system, such as a vineyard, they might choose to cover the vines with a plastic sheet in order to protect the crop from damage from the storm. But in broadacre cropping systems, which usually take up a much larger area of land, we can't really feasibly do that. And so some crop yield loss may occur. And so I think in that, the resilience of our ecosystems is really dependent on whether the timing as well of these climate events happens in the growing season. So, for example, if a heat wave occurs when the grain of a wheat crop is what we in the grain filling stage, where the crop is now actually producing the grain, that can be more detrimental to final yield than, say, if a heat wave occurs at the early growing stage. And so the timing of these events really determines how resilient our systems are at actually responding to and recovering from climate pressure. And so a big question I'm really working towards answering is whether or not we can improve the way in which we measure and detect these climate events and their effect on particularly crop productivity, in order to improve their resilience to climate-related and weather events in time.
Just to build on that, I guess from the adverse side of things, with climate change and those, there's the increasing severity of weather events, especially in Australia. You see, the flooding that's occurring, the once in 100-year floods that are occurring every couple of months right now. How is that sort of impacting the responsiveness and resilience of these crops? Obviously, they don't have as much time to respond or build up resilience to these events. So I'm just wondering if there's if you could comment on that.
Yeah, and so I guess that gets down to the frequency of these events as well. And so, for example, some of our systems are quite resilient in handling one, maybe two events, but when we're seeing these multiple events hitting time and time again, that makes it really difficult to weather. And so, for example, a lot of farmers will build in resilience in their own sort of system so they can afford to lose, well, not afford, but they can tolerate losing a crop in a season if they have a really bad season or lower yield rates. But when that happens back-to-back seasons, and potentially for a third, if the La Nina forecasts are, continue tracking towards another La Nina event, then we could be facing for a third year in a row increased risk of flooding events in the East Coast. And so the resilience of some of these agricultural systems to continue to produce under those conditions becomes a real challenge. And so, yeah, I think we are seeing a lot of really good technological advancements occurring in the agricultural sector that allow us to respond a lot faster to these sort of climate events and recover a lot quicker. But again, it's still an area that we need a huge amount of growth and investment in so that we can really provide the tools that our cropping systems, but also our food production farmers need in order to become more resilient and continue to produce food.
Great, thanks for that. And again, building on top of that, what you've been saying, you do a bit of work in crop cultivars. So how does the idea of crop cultivars sort of fit into this whole discussion around resilience and responsiveness in agriculture ecosystems?
Yeah, and so a crop cultivar is essentially a subset of a particular crop variety. So say we're talking about wheat or corn, there are many different varieties within that particular cropping type that show different traits and resiliences to certain pressures. So for example, understand that. Sorry, my Google phone just turned on. Stop listening to Google. And so essentially, high-performing crop cultivars are crop cultivars that, say, do particularly well, usually at producing a high amount of yield. But more and more, we're looking at other cultivars that are, say, resilient to heat events or are really efficient at using water, and breeding those varieties or those traits into new varieties that are becoming available on the market to allow and provide us some buffer in our cropping systems. In particular, I do a lot of work in cropping systems. And to basically breed resilience into our food production systems that way. And so that's sort of what I guess a high-performing crop cultivar is, and strategies to identify these high-performing crop cultivars more quickly are really important ways to sort of speed up the process that farmers have been doing for centuries now. I mean, genetic breeding has always been a thing. We select for livestock or plant varieties that produce the most amount of yield or that survive a frost event better than the previous generation of crops or other grass varieties, for example. And so a lot of the agricultural research that's going on at the moment is really looking at ways in which we can increase that process and hit those sort of that progression a lot faster, because we don't have a lot of time when it comes to adapting and mitigating the effects of climate change.
Yeah, I definitely agree, more so now than ever. So yeah, thanks for that insight. Just so now moving on and zooming out a little to a bigger picture, regenerative agriculture seems to be a prominent and growing global trend when discussing sustainable farming. So much so that Project Drawdown, as Ben mentioned before, has estimated that regenerative agriculture will increase from an estimated nearly 120,000 square kilometres to between 2.1 to 3.2 million square kilometres by 2050. So Ben, if you could just explain a little bit about what regenerative agriculture is and how those practices around regenerative agriculture ensure a sustainable and secure food system for Australians.
Happy to, and I'm really glad I-Lyn's on this panel as well, because she'll definitely have some really good insights as well as a Churchill Fellow looking into regen ag. And I think that demonstrates, if we've got people looking at this now from that angle, it's certainly in the 8 years that wide open agriculture and our food brand Dirty Clean Food's been really sort of a proponent for regenerative practices. It's really shift from a sort of a niche to what I would say now is sort of an early kind of uptake sort of model, where people are moving beyond the language into just practices. So a good example of that, when people ask me what is regen ag, I say it's farming with nature, not against it. And if they're still listening, which generally, at the pub, they've walked away by then, but if they're still listening, then I go into sort of the more deeper language around building carbon rich soils, looking at that real interaction between mycorrhizal and bacterial health in soil, and using what nature has designed over millennia to really build a secure and resilient, I really like that word, Caitlin, food web that can feed the plant itself without constantly relying on external inputs. External inputs are still used, to be very clear, in regenerative systems, but they're used in a way that really is trying to mitigate their use where they can. To sort of really frame it up, I guess we sort of see regenerative agriculture as being an important alternative. Conventional industrial farming has played an incredible role for producing food, and it has, since its sort of introduction in the 60s, has brought immense gains. But as Ronni mentioned at the start, a lot of those gains have actually been sort of now become quite wasteful. And we believe that farming systems are starting to sort of turn and shift, and farmers themselves and agronomists and input companies are starting to say, is there another way of producing healthy, nutrient-rich food that perhaps there may be some challenge or some reductions in yield, but the overall impact, looking at the wider holistic impact, is dramatically reduced. And that's how we look at everything at wide open agriculture. We apply a 4 returns framework. So it's got to make money because the farmers are in business, we're in business, our customers are often in business. So it's got to make money. It's got to have a return for society and for the farmers and the rural communities. It's got to have a natural return, and it's got to inspire people. And I think that's another thing around climate change and the word resilience. Someone's got to live in regional communities, and someone's got to produce the food. And I think if we're not building structures and ecosystems and infrastructure to encourage not only existing families, but new families to come and farm, I think that really puts also our food sort of system at great risk and peril.
Can I just jump in? And I think the 4 returns are great outcomes for to defining regenerative agriculture. A lot of the conversations I've had about what is regenerative agriculture very practice focused, but I would say that the practices, because you're working with nature, has to be place-based and context-based. Nature is very diverse. We have to work with it, and your farm, it might work well in your farm, might not work well in my farm, and it depends on the kind of systems that you have, the type of soil, the type of water regime that you have. But more and more what I'm seeing globally is people are moving from defining the practices, because they're quite different from farm to farm, from place to place. They're defining it as outcomes-based. They're talking about improving soil health, including carbon sequestration and recovering biodiversity. And some of them include things like, exactly like the 4 returns, sustainability of the communities, what are they returning to their communities? And of course, the sustainability of the businesses. They, have to make a living out of the land, and that's very important.
Yeah, I'll just pick up on that, I-Lyn, just quickly around outcome-based. I think we when we started on this journey, we sort of tried to define what are the sort of the principles and practices around regenerative farming. And that's how we kind of define our regenerative farm plans that allow people to produce under the brand Dirty Clean Food. But the farmers have always said to us, we would love to actually have metrics and we would love to have quantitative numbers so that we can actually see improvements. And that's where we've started to progress now. So those outcomes around soil organic carbon, there's some really exciting technology coming out that is remote sensing that allows you to measure soil organic carbon in sort of 10 metre square blocks to 95% accuracy to a soil core. We're seeing some really exciting genetic data coming out that allows you to measure biodiversity or the types of animals that are on your farm, and particularly endangered species. And that's what the farmers, and I think our consumers, our dirty, clean foodies are kind of looking for. They're looking for real evidence. And I think that's a really exciting shift for the regenerative agriculture movement. It's always been a question around data and science, and I think we're sort of really striving towards that way now. And with that brings more, momentum and encouragement for other farmers to explore alternative farming systems that perhaps move away from conventional industrial and mechanical systems.
I just want to grab Caitlin on in this one, especially around the idea of the carbon-rich soils and the food webs. Caitlin, with your background in carbon sequestration again, it'd just be good to get your views on that and also the data side of things as well.
Yeah, certainly. And I think, data is really important for demonstrating proof of concept. And I think there's a lot of talk going on at the moment about the importance of carbon accounting and carbon crediting systems, but we could use a lot more quantification of carbon going in and carbon coming out of the systems. And so a lot of the work that I do is working with instruments that measure that at the agricultural or the agro ecosystem scale. And so looking at carbon uptake via photosynthesis and then carbon lost from other carbon consumption processes. So soil microbes consuming carbon and releasing that. And so I think until we have a good grasp on net in versus net out from agricultural systems, just even at the plant level, we're really going to struggle to sort of close that carbon cycle loop and understand how we can actually keep carbon in the system. Because at the end of the day, the way we're going to get carbon into these agricultural systems is through the plants, because they're the ones that are capturing it and photosynthesizing and putting it into biomass.
Thank you. I-Lyn, if I can just jump back to you. As a Churchill Fellow with your research on consumer drivers and incentives for regenerative agriculture, as you've been talking about, what can you kind of summarise are like the costs and limitations for farmers to transition to regenerative agriculture practices, and kind of what are the main challenges or apprehensions that we're seeing?
I think that's a very good question. I think in the end, it's regenerative agriculture is quite a contentious term in Australia still. It is getting more mainstream now, like Ben was saying. We're moving into the what do you call that? Not the first movers, but the early adopter phase. Between the 8 and 14% adoption rate. So I think there are challenges in accepting that term, regenerative agriculture, whereas globally there is even more, wider acceptance of that term actually. So one of the challenges is trying to achieve the outcomes of regenerative agriculture, which is, really great outcomes. We're talking about the 4 returns that Ben talked about. But how do we achieve that without using divisive language? And if, unfortunately, regenerative agriculture is a divisive language, then we may have to move away from it into more outcomes-based conversations like natural capital accounting, talking about carbon sequestration into the soil and soil health and recovering biodiversity. And I think this is just an opinion. I feel like, our farmers are they love their land. They're so connected, and they really, it's deep down in their core. It's part of their family. And I feel like with the regenerative agriculture narrative, unfortunately, maybe we've talked about the narrative in a wrong way or in a different way that challenges that values, those deep held personal values that if you become regenerative, you are considered a bad land manager previously, therefore you have to change. But that's never the intent. I don't think that was ever the intent of regenerative agriculture. It's always about maybe there's a better way of doing things so that we can feed our children into the future. And I think, that would be something I think we need to focus on. Because I think, I'm talking about the Western Australian farmers, I actually think a lot of them are doing it anyway, without being too controversial. The practices like, minimum till, keeping cover crops, incorporating livestock, it's part of the system. It's part of what they do anyway.
Ben, you're quite big on the narrative behind regenerative agriculture as well. So you just want to, chip in on this one?
Yeah, I mean, we think the narrative, of dirty, clean food, and when we talk to our online customers, and we have we're in retail now, and our oat milk's in Woolworths, which is really exciting. What we're actually learning is that people just want to be closer to their farmer, and they want to understand the production system. They want to understand how a farmer is making decisions to perhaps reduce chemical usage, to decrease the amount of chemical fertilizer, how they might be using diverse crops and protecting biodiversity. That's all kind of like deeper stories, but at a sort of dirty, clean food level, if you're just making a decision quickly, you do want to just feel like you actually have access to the farmer, that there's nothing sort of hidden. And it is, we called the company Wide Open Agriculture with that intent to really bring what we call conscious consumers and regenerative farmers together. And also regenerative is sort of much more holistic. It's about, the health of that family producing the food, the health of the community around it. And then the production of food. We do grass-fed beef and lamb and chicken, and we're really focused on food waste. So programs like Ronni's are so important to ours, where you actually make sure that there is no waste. So our consumers actually, are really engaged at all levels of the sort of value chain, from the farm, from the way it's produced and no food waste, and right through to packaging as well. So that I think is really exciting, because it is consumer led, but we've always believed the farmer has to be sort of hosted in a dance, if I can quote one of my board directors there, to make sure that no one party is getting too far ahead of the other. And with that, you can actually build a real system around it.
Just to build on that, just for the consumers, I guess, tuning in tonight, is there any way that they can sort of support regenerative farming? I guess in like a very short type of way. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just would say Google regenerative farming and find out as much as you can. Spend a bit of time sort of arming yourself with the knowledge base. Obviously, dirty, clean food, I believe, is an opportunity for people to really understand how West Australian farmers are producing food regeneratively and getting their sort of understanding around it. But, food and farming is really interesting. It's a really engaging topic. So I would just encourage people to get out there and really form their own opinion. I think in climate change debates and conversations around policy, it is so often dominated by electricity generation and transport, which, they're important, but actually food is the most political act you can make every day. So I really believe it's great that you guys have kind of inspired this conversation tonight. And, I encourage other people just to, particularly at a dinner party, at lunch, just have a chat about where your food's come from and how it makes you feel when you understand or don't understand how it's been produced.
Sorry,
Ronni, you want to go?
Oh, it's just that I think it's such an important, this narrative, the narrative around regen, the narrative around food wastage. Those are the challenges, because when we think of tackling climate change, most people think of solar panels, as Ben said, electrification, solar panels or electric cars, but they really think of the impact of the food we eat. And in fact, it's the hugest contributor to waste. One that when I started OzHarvest, I wasn't even aware of, with up to 10% of global greenhouse gas emissions coming from wasted food. And for many, it's so overwhelming that they don't believe they can make an individual difference. So I think Ben's point about talking about where food comes from, talking about our farmers, and talking about how they can make a difference. The good news is, if we go back to Project Drawdown, reducing your food waste is one of the most impactful ways to take action. And so once we discovered this, we knew we had to do something about it. And by connecting the dots and showing people that there is a good news story about how you can take action. And it actually led to our first national campaign around raising awareness to get the nation to use it up. It's based on research we did with Monash University. And I don't know if you can see this. Can you see our use it up tape little?
Oh, there we can. Oh, yeah.
Nearly.
Okay, well, this is what use it up tape looks like. Can you see that?
Bring it closer to you. Closer to you, Ronni.
Closer to me. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So anyway, use it up tape is just, it's a visual and a very simple and easy way to get people to start thinking about you not wasting food. It says, pick me, cook me, eat me up. It's tape that you put on a shelf in your fridge. And it's so that you put everything, so you start valuing food and that you start understanding what it's taken to grow that food, whether it's regen or not, that you know, energy, fuel, labor, love that it's taken to grow food. So just by the way, you can get this use it up tape free on the OzHarvest website. But we have to get all of us talking about regen, talking, you know, farming, talking about not wasting food.
If I could also jump in there, and I completely concur with what you're saying, Ronni, about the power each consumer have, especially with food, and the impact they can make on the sustainability of our food systems. And I think what Ben said about telling the narrative, the full story of the farmer is very powerful, because food consumers are very visceral consumers. They buy with feeling. There is that logical side of things, but you find that when you go to the eggshells, for example, you look, oh, there's a picture of a farmer. He looks happy. There's a dog right next to him. They look happy. They're third generation farmer. Those stories move the food consumer. And to weave that story of regenerative agriculture and food waste and the sustainability and how the power and telling the story of the farmer, the full food system, and to put that power into the consumer's hands so that they know what the impact they can make.
Great. I'd just like to come back to the tape, Ronni, actually. Obviously, that's on an individual level in terms of what households and people can do. Again, this might be a bit, not forward, but be a bit out of the scope, but is there anything that, I guess, the high level businesses can do? You know, we talk about like supermarkets, and there's a best before date, there's a use by date, there's all these dates, and that's obviously adding to the confusion of wastage, because, you know, people might see a best before, but it's still edible or still usable.
Absolutely. I'm
so
happy to talk about that. But before we do that, out of the 7.6 million tons of food that's wasted every year, 500,000 tons comes from supermarkets and 2.5 million tons comes from our homes. That's why we started concentrating on all of us, because the biggest thing for us is we feel so powerless, and yet all the power is with us not to waste food. But just let's touch on this notion, because there's so much confusion around best before and use by, and it is a huge contributor to food waste. And so best before is really about quality. It's what the manufacturer has deemed that by this day, 22nd of August, this pot of jam is best, or this pot of honey, which is a joke because honey can last forever, is best before this date. But it's perfectly safe for consumption for months after that. It's just that the manufacturer deemed that's what best before is. Use by is about safety. And the manufacturer has said this product needs to be consumed by this date. Now, in Europe, the EU did research, and if they shifted use by dates and best before dates on fresh produce by 2 days. 2 days. So they moved it from the 22nd to the 24th, and they found that in supermarkets, there was 50% less food waste, and in homes, 60%. That was just shifting that date by 2 days. So we understand how powerful those dates are, and we are working on advocacy around making the clarification, getting it clear, but it's a big subject and a huge cause of food waste.
While we're talking about kind of globally and the international space, what can you kind of comment on what countries are leading the way in tackling national food waste, and how are these practices implemented?
So countries like the UK, Denmark, and France are all actively measuring and reporting on their national food waste targets. And in the UK, their success story has been the collaborative action gained through what they've called the Courtauld Commitment, where 250 companies, including most of the major food businesses, have signed up to a voluntary agreement to halve their food waste by implementing target, measure, and act to achieve global environmental goals. They're investing in national campaigns to change consumer behavior, including running Food Waste Action Week. So Denmark has reduced its food waste by 25% in 5 years, just by introducing a number of initiatives, including consumer education campaigns. The supermarkets offer food in loose pack, not in packaging, so people can buy what they need. And our biggest challenge is that here in Australia, we are lagging behind so significantly. So there's so much for us to learn from these practices and to observe, learn, and we have the opportunity to forge collective action on goal 12.3. Through the Stop Food Waste CRC, we've just launched a voluntary pact for business, for food businesses to sign up to, and it's very slow. You know, maybe we've got 10 or 12. So there's all these initiatives are there for us to learn from, and we've only got 7.5 years to halve food waste by 2030.
Yeah, talking about the targets, it was the UNEP Food Waste Index that ranked Australia as the 10th most wasteful country in the world. In 2017, we saw the Australian government committed to halving food waste by 2030, as you said. I guess, do you think this is feasible, or if not, how can Australia model and learn from these best practices? I know you've spoken a little bit about it, but I guess what are the key kind of processes, practices, and policies that we need to tackle food waste?
So I think, first of all, to understand our role in it. It's not about pointing fingers and saying business and industry once we understand those stats. And, you know, that's really why we created this campaign, Use It Up. There's a new one going out. It's a grannies campaign because food labeling only came in the 70s. So our grannies didn't use food labeling. They smelt the produce, they tasted it, they used their own common sense, and we've lost that. So we do need consumer campaigns. We need to get all of us to understand our own power as to how we can participate. All the major food businesses should sign up to the food pact. Government has got to ensure that the right incentives are placed. They've got to invest. You know, you're right. In 2017, they decided. In fact, in 2015, OzHarvest got our country to commit to halving food waste. It then took 2017 till another decision. We are now 2022, and urgent action needs to be taken. And we have power, and we can demand that.
Perfect. Thank you, Ronni. I just wanted to jump back to I-Lyn, if I can, kind of while we're talking about this global and international discussion. You've looked into major global food companies' commitments to regenerative agriculture. Do you think that this will help or hinder regenerative agriculture in the long term?
I think in the short answer to that is, I guess it depends on how much the farmers are involved in defining the approach that these big companies are undertaking. So we've got the biggest food company in the world, Nestle, second biggest, PepsiCo, making commitments towards advancing regenerative agriculture in throughout their supply chains, and they're doing that as a, I guess, part of their strategy, a pathway towards achieving their net zero emissions targets, if you like. So a lot of the companies, their strategy is to work directly with farmers, which is great. Developing the what it means, what is regenerative agriculture, the way that wide open agriculture has developed, like, when you source for these regenerative products, what does it mean? So I'm seeing a lot of all these companies working with the farmers to work with them to advance the practices across, I think General Mills wanted 1 million acres of land by 2030 to be regenerative. And I actually think regenerative agriculture is here to stay. It's not just the major food companies that are making commitments. These are big companies with big marketing budgets, with lots of analysts, behind them, predicting the future, the different scenarios. But also what we're starting to see here is in policy in the EU, where we have, there is the European Academies of Science and Advisory Council writing a document called Regenerative Agriculture in the EU, providing recommendations on how regenerative agriculture principles should be incorporated in their farm to fork policy. And the recent New Zealand EU free trade agreement, I think that was signed on the 30th of June, or takes effect on the 30th of June of this year, actually consisted of a statement where both parties will work together to advance regenerative agriculture. So that is a very fascinating, I guess, development for me. So it's not just the food companies, now we're moving into policies, government policies.
Jim, sorry, Chris, if I could just add that, I guess, just from our experience as a company that kind of embraced it really early and, kind of led at times with a bloody nose on regen ag. What's exciting and what we're open to is big breweries, big dairy, big grain companies are willing to sort of engage in a conversation, whether or not it's around the word regenerative, we don't really care, but it's around looking at practices that, are making tangible impacts on climate change and biodiversity loss. So we did a really nice piece of work with CBH, which is the largest cooperative bulk grain handler, with Deep Herd, had some great consultants that backed that work. And we just looked at, so what are all the calculators out there that can measure emissions on farm? And we sort of identified one that's, public access through University of Melbourne called the PIC calculator. So it's just all kind of steps in the right direction. So it does feel like there's real momentum there right across the sort of spectrum of food companies. But we're proud that we kind of have led in that front and want to sort of stay in that leading position.
Great. I'd just like to jump back to Caitlin as well, while we're talking about, I guess, like global leaders and best practices. In your sort of space, Caitlin, especially around crop cultivars, is there any best practices that you've been sort of watching or keeping a tab on around the world?
In what context? In terms of improving food production, or in terms of? We'll go for food production. Yeah. Food production. Cool. And so I guess in my introduction, when you introduced me before, you briefly touched on some collaborations or a project that I was collaborating on when I spent time in the US, the Realizing Increased Photosynthetic Efficiency project. And so that was really looking at ways in which we can increase the efficiency of plant photosynthesis to get more carbon taken up and put into below ground root structures, for example, but also into producing more food. And so by basically tapping into and increasing the efficiency of photosynthesis, we can look at not only getting food produced faster by the plants if they're more efficient at converting sunlight into the end product, which is biomass and grain for grain crops, for example, but also in storing carbon in below ground root structures. There's also a lot of work going on in the space of moving away from fossil fuel generation into bioenergy fuel sources. So that's really producing fuel from bioethanol and biodiesel, which are plant-based products. And so they're termed second generation fuel products, and they're really aiming to be a sort of stepping stone away from fossil fuel reliant fuel production to more sustainable fuel production systems. And so those are sort of some of the strategies that are occurring to, I guess, tackle carbon in agricultural systems and in food security and I guess fuel security as well. But yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of really great approaches going on. I've been sort of scrolling through the questions as we've been chatting. We've got some really cool Q&A questions coming up. And I think it's not a one sort of silver bullet is going to get us to this target. It's going to require an approach across a huge number of scales, reducing food waste, increasing agricultural production through scientific and technological advances, and a whole other range of different approaches that we haven't even thought of yet.
Yeah, that seems really, really fascinating in terms of when you bring in the photosynthesis and increasing, sort of manipulating those processes as well. That seems like very mind-boggling to me at least. And yeah, you summed it up pretty well. So just a closing question. And like we've been discussing, there is no panacea or a silver bullet to solving this issue of food security, but also when you sort of think about climate change. And there's obviously multiple practices that work together across the food system and also across scales and through various actors. So it's quite a complex web and complex system that we're seeing globally. So just to finish up the conversation before we move on to the Q&As, so each panelist, can we get like a 30-second takeaway or less of what should be done to ensure that Australia has a secure food system for future generations? May I start with Ronni again?
Sure. So very quickly, we know that our Use It Up campaign gets results. Let's make Use It Up the slip slop of food waste. We have the solution. We need to stop throwing food away. If 7.6 million tons could be rescued, it would feed everyone in Australia for 6 months. We just have to do it. Stop throwing food away. From a government point of view, we need investment in the campaigns and education to stop food waste.
Great. I guess building on that idea of investment, Caitlin, do you want to jump in next?
Sure. I think I'd like to build on what Ronni said and sort of empower the people. I think, we have a huge ability. Yes, as a single individual person, we can't really do much. And I teach a second year unit on understanding the climate system and, presenting the science on how we know that the climate system is changing can be a bit doom and gloom. And at the end of class, quite often the students will say, well, what can we do though? What can we actually achieve?
Stop food waste individually.
Exactly. And individually,
something for people to do.
That's right. I said individually, we can all chip in together. We can reduce food waste. We can make conscious decisions about where we're purchasing our food from. We can push policymakers. And if we all do our little bit, then collectively as a population, we can start to make a really huge difference, and we can start to really get, large scale changes occurring. And I think that message doesn't always quite get through to the end consumer.
I guess building on that narrative and that message, Ben, would you like to jump in next?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great panel. I'm loving what Ronni and Caitlin and I-Lyn are all saying. I mean, I think it is, it's that sort of basis of valuing food and spending that sort of little bit of extra time to understand how the food is being produced from the farm. And, it is a big commitment to call yourself regenerative in a system or in a small community that perhaps that isn't the norm. So, I think backing farmers that are sort of at least asking themselves hard questions and then taking steps in that right direction, I think consumers can do a lot there. They can really back it. So I think people should feel empowered. Like Ronni said, valuing food and not wasting it. And as Caitlin was saying, really being able to sort of feel like you're empowered, that it's not something you just have to take a backseat on and wait for government or wait for big business to make a decision for you. You can have a crack at your very next meal.
Great. I guess to close it out, I-Lyn, would you like to? Yeah.
Definitely would like to build on that. Exactly. I think consumers hold the power to make the impact. And to add on to that, I would encourage, if you want to make a difference, go out there, ask your supermarkets, ask your greengrocers, ask your the chefs in the restaurant you go to, is this regenerative? How is this food produced? Where did it come from? Is this food produced with a soil health in mind, with biodiversity in mind? Those questions will then set like a chain reaction through the supply chain, if you like, and it will get back into the farmer's end. So I think that is also very important. And for the government side of things, we just have to support the businesses to tell your story, support the farmers in telling their story, so that those stories, those great stories, could reach the consumers. And I would also like to throw in a little bit about R&D. We still need a lot of research and development. Our climate is changing, and it would, unfortunately, I fear that it would continue to change. So we need that level of investment in R&D to ensure that our our systems are resilient, whether it's new cultivars or how you produce the food in these changing environments.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, for that discussion. That was very, very interesting. We're now going to jump to our Q&A discussion. So we've had some questions that have been sent throughout the discussion tonight by some of the audience members. So thank you to all of those who sent some questions in. We're going to try and work through some of these now. The first one that has come through, it's kind of, I think, put to everyone, but if anyone specifically wants to chime in, the question was, I would have anticipated that vertical farming would have been widely adopted, for example, by major supermarket chains long before now. Why has this not eventuated?
I'll take a stab if, and I assume vertical farming means greenhouse farming. I'm just going to use that like in greenhouses and using robotics and agri-tech. In Western Australia, we have a lot of land. And I would sum it up by saying, I think we don't have a lot of that because of economics. The what do you call it? The financial ins and outs, it just doesn't make sense when we have land and we have natural capital that will sustain the more natural form, the more natural systems of food production, which is on land and using the water and using the rain. While that is available more freely and more cheaply than actually farming it in vertical farms, vertical warehouses and greenhouses, I would say that that's why the vertical farming approach is not widespread, especially in Australia. However, if we don't look after our natural capital, we may have to move towards that in the future.
I think it's really interesting. I've been investigating. I've just come back from Vietnam, and there's an Australian scientist that has created what the Fin Review has termed the next agri-tech unicorn, and that is a vertical farming system that is absolutely brilliant, and we're looking at bringing it back right here. So currently doing stuff. So yes, there is plenty land, but we have to look at the quality. And as you say, regen is so important. It's got to be the quality of the produce that comes out of it. So I think it's an interesting notion, and I think it is going to be more widely looked at.
Yeah, I'd like to just add briefly on that, if I can. Is that okay?
Yeah.
I think too, the pressure from climate change hasn't quite necessitated widespread adoption yet of vertical farming. But I think as we move towards or through this century, and if certain areas or certain regions start to become unviable for particularly like horticultural cropping, for example, if you can't grow lettuce up in Gingin anymore, just as a throwaway example, then we might start to see more widespread adoption of some of these techniques. But I think, I-Lyn really nailed it. We just haven't had that economic pressure and need to go into it just yet, but it's really good to know that it's sitting there as a resource that we, could potentially expand on if needed.
Thank you. Ben, did you have anything to add?
Oh, it's been really well captured, actually. Yeah, that's certainly when we've looked at them, and we've seen some really exciting technologies in Singapore and in America. There's a supermarket chain that now does put a vertical farm. But what they're finding is it's particularly for specific, the herbs and the high value crops. I think as I-Lyn suggested, the vine crops like the tomatoes and the capsicums and the cucumbers, it is hard to beat, I guess, the economics of not paying for anything above you to be, some of these systems are up to like $100 per square metre in CapEx to install. So you really need to make sure you've got your economics and your supply chain worked out. But as Ronni said, bringing the veggies back into the peri-urban or urban area could make a lot of sense and be a really important response to accelerating climate change and variable weather patterns, because horticulture really needs a very narrow band. So I think we'll see more of them, that's for sure.
Well, certainly I can just share that in Sydney, in Woolworths in Double Bay, there's already vertical herbs.
Okay.
It is there.
Yep.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. We've got another question that's come through. It's been put to everyone, I assume. Genetic modification and gene editing techniques offer the fastest means to breed higher yielding and more resilient cultivars or varieties, but there is a significant stigma against these techniques. Does the panel have a view on how this might be overcome?
Caitlin, you're going to probably jump in on that one first.
Yeah, I saw this come through earlier. It's a great question from Peter. And you're absolutely right. There is significant stigma around these techniques. And I think it comes down to how it's communicated and the perceptions on genetic modification as being this demonic thing that, creepy scientists in a lab are sort of sitting there, editing genes and, doing weird things. But I think communicating the flip side of that in some of the genetic modifications that have really allowed cropping varieties to withstand pest and disease. For example, BT corn in the United States. We wouldn't have the corn industry in the US and globally even without genetic modification that essentially took a gene from a papaya plant and inserted it into the corn crop to make it more resistant and overcome the pest of the rootworm that was essentially decimating crops right across the US. And so I think in that, farmers, when the rootworm was really at its worst, were losing whole cropping systems to this pest. And with this BT corn, this genetically modified corn, we've been able to overcome that. And some of you may have seen the recent news from actually out of the US as well, from the group that I used to work with on the Right Project. They've essentially genetically modified soybean plants to increase yield by 20%. It was on the ABC News earlier this week or last week. And so essentially, that is essentially just accelerating the processes that were going to occur in nature already, but they just take a lot more time to occur in nature. And so it's really looking at ways of, with climate change pressure sort of at our front door, we need faster techniques, and genetic modification really gives us the tools to be able to achieve these processes faster. But at the same time, there's really, really rigorous rules around the application of genetically modified crops and how, I guess it's a really highly regulated field, but because there's so much stigma around it. And so I think
how the narrative is so important. The way you're sharing it is so different from, it's just so important that the narrative around it is comprehensive.
Yes, and so I think communicating the benefits and that it's not this dark, thing that scientists are doing in the depths of a lab sort of thing, and that it's actually beneficial for our food security challenges, and that there are good things that can come from genetic modification. And we're not talking about Einstein crops or anything like that. We're talking about small modifications that can have a big impact on food production and yield. And so I think sort of communicating that and changing that narrative is a really important approach, because yeah, Peter's point was absolutely correct. It's, you know, it's the fastest way we've got to be able to make crops more resilient to the oncoming pressures from climate change.
I guess this is a follow-on question, but is there any like ways we can sort of ensure that that narrative does get pushed through, away from that sort of creepy scientist in the dark room to like something a bit more forward thinking and hopeful?
Well, I mean, I guess there's always going to be the, you know, two sides of the coin argument, but the more that we talk about it and communicate, you know, the benefits of it, I think is really important. We've sort of seen a bit of a shift in the narrative around climate change and the acceptance of climate change in the sort of the public sphere over the last sort of 5-10 years. You know, back in the early, or in the, when climate change started to become a thing back in the 1980s and early 70s as well, it was sort of the language around the IPCC reports and whether or not humans were having an impact on the climate system was pretty mild. Like, there's this thing called climate change and we think it's happening, humans might be causing it, but we're not really sure. And as we've progressed to now, we've seen the language and the communication around that message really strengthen. And now, you know, there's scientists right around the world that are researching and looking into the causes and effects of climate change. And we're pretty damn certain that humans are playing a significant role in accelerating it. And so I think taking some of the learnings from that and applying that to the genetic modified crops or plants space is a really important, I guess, target to sort of help to reduce the perception that GM is only a bad thing.
We have a GMO-free policy at Dirty Clean Food, and that really kind of, I guess, aligns to what our consumers are asking us to do. I actually think, yeah, we're definitely the other side of the coin. You know, when you look at the evidence, yeah, the sort of the cultivars and the new genetic, they do offer potential increases in yield, but in regards to the cost to the farmer, to the farming system, they're often associated with, you know, a new chemical or a new spray. Certainly, it's sort of a very wide spectrum, but I think it's sort of giving consumers and humans and everyone not really a fair chance when they say you need to be better educated, because I think GE's been around for a long time now. People have made like a conscious sort of investigation. You know, everyone's got something in their hand that's going to tell them everything they need to know to research it. So, you know, we actually feel like the better approaches are looking at sort of nurturing healthier soil. And although GE has had significant R&D money and has a very sort of commercialized model to it, so it does get a lot of research. I guess we find programs and research around regenerative agriculture and cultivating resilient, healthy soils and soil biomes has much less, you know, really is at that sort of nascent stage of R&D. And we often get questioned, where is the peer-reviewed research? It's like, yeah, we're also asking that question. Who will fund it though? Because the commercial model for healthy soil, I guess, isn't as clear as for new cultivars and genetic engineering. So that's certainly our position now. So yeah, I think it's one of those really interesting topics. It definitely always has two sides to it.
Perfect. Okay, we'll jump on to another question that's come through. How big a population can we support in a sustainable fashion into the future? Is there a limit below which we might not go? How much is the amount import the phosphorus we end up exporting important as the factor in considerations? There's quite a few there, so if you want to break it down one by one.
I'm just going to answer very quickly on one level. 1/3 of all food that we produce is going to waste. 1/3. So there's enough food for 1/3 more of our population. So if we're currently on 8 billion and or 7 billion and we're going to be 9 billion, there is enough food. Our challenge is the supply chain and the whole aspect of managing our food system, valuing food, etc. So that's just one answer.
I think I-Lyn, did you have anything to add?
Probably not on how big a population we can support, because I think that requires all sorts of smart people doing all sorts of modeling and analysis. But I think that Ronnie's right. It's food waste, it plays such a huge part. We do produce enough food to sustain, I'm sure, a certain number bigger than what the current population is. Ronni, you probably know the numbers to this. And but if a third of it's wasted, it doesn't, we then need to consume more natural capital to produce more food for this growing population. But I just wanted to talk about that regenerative agriculture applying more local supply. I think at the moment it is, but if you look at wide open agriculture and dirty clean food, they're starting to make steps into the export market. And I don't think that regenerative agriculture, while the term refers to actual production practices, I don't think it applies to more local supply. I think one of the challenges is to ensure we have that kind of supply chain that supports companies like wide open agriculture to be able to communicate that they are regenerative to the end consumer.
Perfect, thank you. We've got another one that's come through. There is quite a lot of debate about cosmetic looking foods that are preferred by consumers that supermarkets use all the time. We kind of touched on this supermarket notion before. Supermarkets now have an odd bunch, but it is minor and cheaper, devaluing food, even when it is ugly. I guess, do you have any data on how much in terms of percentage of food is ugly and not accepted by the supermarkets?
Well, I can answer that. There's not even any doubt that one of the biggest reasons that food is wasted is because of its size or because of its appearance. So there are a couple of things we can do about this. First of all, it is the highest growing category in the supermarkets that have ugly fruit and veg. So that is a good thing because we are shifting and changing our behavior. But until such time as we do shift and change our behavior and are willing to choose a banana with a freckle, when I went to the Northern Territory or to Queensland onto a banana farmer's farm, first of all, I had no idea what it takes to grow a banana. Just to give you an idea, between every hand of bananas is like tissue paper. It's the most extraordinary labor-intensive product. That farmer put aside, threw away a third before he even farmed it, sent it down to the supermarkets because it was just going to cost him too much to send it and then have it rejected. So our challenge is, and again, this lies with education and with understanding that it's not about the size. We never used to, until supermarkets created shelves that took cucumbers and wanted them the same size. That's how we get cucumbers that all look the same. It's not how they are grown. So until such time as we are willing to shift and change our behavior and understand that it's not about the look, it's about the quality and the taste. And actually, ugly fruit and veg tastes way better than perfect fruit and veg. But it's all about education. And that is really why we've got education programs that are going into schools, because we've grown up in a society that food is too available and it's too pretty and it's what we're used to. Our grandparents, we go back to our grannies, they didn't choose beautiful apples. They picked it off a tree and there were some that were this size and some that were that size.
I guess from the adverse side of it, away from the consumer, but more from the producer or the farmer, I-Lyn or Ben, do you want to jump in? Maybe you've looked at this, I-Lyn, in your research, or Ben, you might have spoken to some people being out in the Wheatbelt yourself. But yeah, how do the farmers feel about this as well in terms of that production side of things and having to throw this stuff away? It seems like there's a bit of a disconnect between producer, supermarket and consumer as well. So I'm just wondering how that sort of chain links up.
I guess it is, the farmers know that, you know, supermarkets demand a certain standard of their food. I was visiting a farmer horticulture farmer, and he said to me, look at this cool room full of stuff that was rejected by Coles. What was wrong with it? There was his beans and they had extra marks on it. And he said they just rejected it. It was all packaged, ready to go, sent it to Coles. Coles had a look and said, I'm sorry, you just can't do it. And he said to me, I don't know what to do with it now.
I'm going to I have to interject. Coles puts on its shelf, and it's not about me protecting the supermarkets. They put on their shelves what we buy. We need to walk with our feet. We need to make a statement. If we're willing to buy ugly beans, there will be ugly beans on the shelf.
Yes.
So our challenge is not to blame. I mean, again, I'm not here to defend the supermarkets because I deal with them and I have the same challenges. And that's the reason we're rescuing food at the back of every single supermarket. But until such time as we are willing to shift and change our standards, that is what we're going to get. If we buy cherries in the wrong season, it's because we're buying them that they are on the shelf.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it does translate to Coles rejecting it because they can't sell it. They just can't. And I have to say, personally, I'm guilty of that. When I go to the supermarket, I want the pretty Bravo apple, the pretty beans. And if there's a dent, I just don't. But one of the best avocados I've ever had came from a regenerative farmer in Jemah. It looked ugly. It was so ugly on the outside. I would not, if I walked into a supermarket, I was like, what is wrong with this? But I opened up on the inside, it was perfect, perfect. So what's the lesson here? We just have to, I have to overcome my own aversion towards ugly fruits, vegetables, everything.
Collect 30 tons of it every month because it's perfect, but it's because we have chosen not to buy it.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, everyone. That's all the time we have for discussion questions. I think that brings us to the end of tonight's event. We've covered an extraordinary amount of ground on these topics, and Chris and I would like to immensely thank the panel for your time tonight. You've all brought such a unique perspective and background, and we're really, really grateful to have been able to pick your brains tonight. We would also like to thank the UWA PPI team, Beck and Chris and Charlotte, on their guidance and assistance in making this event happen, and for supporting and letting Chris and I take the reins on this one. While we have got the audience still here, we would like to mention some of the upcoming events that the UWA Public Policy Institute has. You can find them all on our website if you would like to have a look and register. We've got two actually coming up next week. So on Wednesday morning, we have one titled If Voting Wasn't Compulsory, Would You? Civic Participation and Democracy. That'll be at the University Club at UWA. And on Thursday evening, we have a new reform agenda for Australian schooling policy, running from 5:30 to 7 p.m. And lastly, later in October, we have Imagining a New Policy Agenda for Australian Arts and Culture, which is running on Thursday evening, the 6th of October. That one's running at the State Library of WA as well. So again, thank you to everyone tonight for your time and for our panel for their discussion and enthusiasm in these topics. We really hope and assure that these topics and questions will come up again, and we will continue to discuss them as consumers and on all other levels as well. So thanks again to everyone, and have a great evening.
Thank you.